Welcome to Didactic, Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Board Study Edition. I am your host, Dr. O'Leary, a Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Fellow in the National Capital Region. This is a podcast I designed myself to help myself and other CAPS Fellows study for their boards, but anyone interested in human development or behavioral health will also get something out of this. For a rundown on how it's produced, please see episode 1. I'm using AI to assist me in the content creation, and episode 1 explains how I do this. Even though I'm using AI, all of the content in the podcast should be considered to be my own opinion and no one else's. I take full responsibility for it. If you find errors in the content, I would love to hear about it. You can go to scidactic.com and fill out a form there to let me know. In episode 8, I started discussing temperament theory with an introduction to Alexander Thomas and Stella Chess. They first developed a temperament formulation by following 141 children longitudinally through time, which really hadn't been done before. They proposed 9 dimensions of temperament that they then reduced to 3 basic categories. They categorized children as either being easy, difficult, or slow to warm up. But within each of those categories, there's a lot of information. And following Thomas and Chess, there were many theorists adding to, combining, reorganizing, and proposing their own ideas. I'm going to talk about some of those today. And theorists like Jerome Kagan, Jeffery Allan Gray, Mary Rothbart, and others that focused more on interactions between things like the environment or parenting and temperament, like Nancy Eisenberg, Alice Schermerhorn, and John Bates. I'm going to start with Jeffery Allan Gray, partly because some people might not even consider him to be a temperament researcher. He was a more prominent figure in personality theory than in temperament theory, but he proposed a model that linked what he called different brain systems to individual differences in our behaviors and our emotional responses, and that's what temperament is. So temperament can be seen as like a basic aspect of personality. It's really hard for me to separate the two in my head. Like someone's temperament is basically like the starting point for their personality. Now, Gray proposed systems in the brain that could actually go a long way to help explain temperament, and they're very similar to what other theorists had. So I'm going to include them here first. Jeffery Allan Gray's central idea was that personality and temperament arise from the interaction of 3 fundamental brain systems. The first brain system was called the behavioral approach system, the second, the behavioral inhibition system, and the third, the fight, flight, or freeze system. His conception of these systems is very similar to what other people propose about temperament, things like inhibition or disinhibition. So let me start with his behavioral approach system. The behavioral approach system is what motivates our behaviors towards some sort of reward. You could call it towards some sort of pleasure, similar to what Freud referred to as the libido, you could say. Now, people with a strong behavioral approach system tend to be more impulsive. They're sensation-seeking, but they're also optimistic. So they go toward things. They approach things more frequently. The system basically is like an accelerator in Gray's conception. It drives us toward things, especially things that we desire. And it's activated by different cues in the environment of things that were rewarding before or are intrinsically rewarding. So it motivates us to seek out this pleasure, to achieve goals. So people with a strong behavioral approach system may be more impulsive and more optimistic, more sensation-seeking, more driven by rewards. And you can see how, like, in an extreme way, someone who is driven by their behavioral approach system might be called manic. The next is the behavioral inhibition system. Gray proposes this system responds to things like punishment, but also to novelty and to uncertainty. So new things and uncertain things promote some inhibition. Words that psychiatrists use that would describe this system are anxiety or avoidance behaviors. So people with a strong behavioral inhibition system are prone to things like worry and fear and cautiousness, potentially even overcautiousness. So the system acts kind of like brakes, making us more vigilant in the face of a potential threat or uncertainty until we can figure it out. It's triggered by these cues of punishment, memories of the past, conflict, or novelty, which is basically uncertainty. People with a strong behavioral inhibition system may be anxious, worried, but they're very risk averse and very sensitive to punishment. The last system that Gray describes is the fight, flight, or freeze system. So this system is responsible for immediate threats. It triggers fear and escape behaviors. It's not an overall condition of the body, but it kicks in when we face an immediate danger. So it's less tied directly to personality, but it is crucial for understanding fear and panic responses when they are intense. So the first two, behavioral approach system and behavioral inhibition system, have more to do with temperament and personality. The last one has more to do with what happens in more extreme circumstances. Gray argued that there are individual differences in the strengths of these different systems, and that leads to variations in your temperament and your personality. For example, someone with a dominant behavioral approach system might be more extroverted and risk-taking, while someone with a dominant behavioral inhibition system might be more introverted. This model is also influential in understanding things like anxiety and impulsivity and other potentially pathological traits that a human can have. What makes this system distinct from everything else I'm going to talk about today is it is explicitly kind of neuropsychological. It draws a lot on things like animal research, pharmacological studies, how drugs affect humans and animals, and directly on human personality research. So he really was trying to identify what specific brain regions or networks and what specific neurochemicals are involved in each of these three systems. So it's a very explicitly neuropsychological view of temperament and personality. But it had a large influence on temperament research, even if it wasn't considered maybe directly temperament research. That was Jeffery Allan Gray's reinforcement sensitivity theory of personality and temperament. And it relies on defining three different brain systems kind of work together to either motivate someone to move toward something or to move away from something. The next researchers I'm going to talk about are more explicitly temperament researchers, but they draw on ideas like Gray's. For example, Mary Rothbart talked about temperament as being constitutionally based, individual differences in reactivity and self-regulation. That sounds a lot like Gray. And it means that temperament is rooted in biology. But Rothbart also thought that it could be shaped over time by experience. Rothbart defined two basically key components for temperament. One was reactivity, and the other self-regulation. Reactivity just is how easily and intensely a child reacts to stimuli. So it could be a positive reactivity, for example, the tendency to approach new experiences, or negative reactivity, a tendency to respond with frustration or fear or anger or sadness. That sounds a lot like the behavioral activation and behavioral inhibition systems, but that's not what she called them. The next thing that Rothbart emphasized was self-regulation, so the child's ability to manage those reactions and their behaviors. Self-regulation requires effortful control, practicing the ability to inhibit impulses, to focus attention where it needs to go, to plan actions. And this requires the ability to shift your attention in the correct direction and to sustain focus on a goal. There are different dimensions of temperament that affect our reactivity and self-regulation. One that she described was the extroversion or kind of surgency dimension. This refers to the overall activity level and maybe positive anticipation that a child has, their impulsivity, and their sensation seeking. The other is negative affectivity. So this focuses on things like fear, anger, sadness, discomfort, frustration. These are all things that Thomas and Chess kind of talked about in their 9 dimensions, but she defines them more specifically as relating to a person's reactivity and self-regulation. When thinking about Rothbart, then we need to think about reactivity, whether it's positive or negative, and then self-regulation, the ability to effortfully control what we do and to orient our attention in a certain direction and maintain that attention. Another temperament researcher, Jerome Kagan, focused on something similar, but he really put a lot of emphasis on behavioral inhibition. So that's the tendency to avoid or withdraw to unfamiliar situations. He also believed that temperament had a biological basis and that it can predict anxiety and shyness. He kind of felt like the fundamental thing was a child's ability to inhibit or not. So he described 2 kinds of temperaments, inhibited and uninhibited temperament. The inhibited child is kind of shy and timid and fearful, and they tend to react to unfamiliar situations with avoidance or withdrawal, especially when they're younger. But they can warm up to that. It doesn't necessarily control them, but it provides them with their basic approach to the world. And then there are what he describes uninhibited children. They're very bold, they're sociable, they're outgoing, they're really comfortable with novelty and change. They're not bothered by the fact that things aren't the same all the time. Kagan believed whether or not you are inhibited or uninhibited is biologically controlled. And it has a lot to do with the brain and the neurotransmitter systems involved in the brain, very similar to Gray's ideas. However, Kagan also acknowledged the role of environmental factors in shaping that temperament through time. So there's an interaction between nature and nurture in shaping individual outcomes as a child develops. But they basically start as either inhibited or uninhibited. When thinking about Kagan, those are the words that should probably pop into the mind first. Inhibited or uninhibited. The next researchers I'm going to talk about, kind of lumping together, because they focused a lot on environmental factors or parenting styles as a way to shape temperament through time. So this is Eisenberg and Schermerhorn and Bates. So Schermerhorn and Bates were researchers that worked together. And they focused on how temperament interacts with parenting and the broader environment to shape a child's social adjustment throughout their development. So for them, that concept that I talked about before, goodness of fit, was very important. The match between a child's temperament and their environment, especially parenting styles, had great influence on development according to their model. They proposed something called a transactional model. So this is where a child's temperament and parenting just mutually influence each other over time. They have feedback toward each other and they can change the parenting approach and it can change the child's temperament. But temperament remains a basic predictor of a person's social competence, their peer relationships, and their development of psychopathology. Schermerhorn and Bates drew a lot on Rothberg's model. They focused on dimensions like extroversion, surgency, negative affectivity, and effortful control. But what they added to this was a transactional approach. Eisenberg did something similar. She thought about the temperament as emotional development, self-regulation, and social competence. But she emphasized the interplay between a child's emotional reactivity, especially their negative emotions like anger and sadness, and their ability to regulate those emotions. She talked also about effortful control, the importance of being able to manage emotions inhibit impulses, and behave pro-socially. And this results in the socialization process. So she also talked about how parenting and social experiences influence development of self-regulation and social competence. But she focuses more on effortful control, impulsivity, and emotionality, as opposed to Schermerhorn and Bates that focused more on kind of this transactional interaction between temperament and parents or the broader environment. Both Eisenberg and Schermerhorn and Bates emphasized the role of parenting and social experiences. Both highlighted the importance of self-regulation and emotional adjustment. Both viewed temperament as dynamic, so it's influenced by what's going on around them. And both thought that temperament contributed to risk in the future, whether or not a child was going to be resilient or have other mental health issues. But Schermerhorn and Bates focused more on goodness of fit between temperament and the environment, and Eisenberg emphasized the specific role of emotional regulation and social competence of the child. Let me wrap up today by reviewing and comparing and contrasting some of the researchers I've just talked about. Let's start with Gray. So Gray focused on this broad theory of kind of personality and emotion and talked about multiple brain systems. So these brain systems were the behavioral approach system, the behavioral inhibition system, and the fight, flight, freeze system. Gray thought that individual differences in the strengths of these systems led to variations in temperamental and personality traits, things like impulsivity, anxiety, fearfulness. Gray drew a lot on animal research, pharmacological studies, and human personality questionnaires. So specifically, Gray's approach was neuropsychological. Next we have Kagan, and Kagan focused on what he called behavioral inhibition or disinhibition, particularly relating to fear and anxiety, and thought that inhibition was kind of the basis. The behavioral inhibition system was the basis of a child's approach to the world. When it wasn't there, a child was uninhibited. Kagan focused a lot on the child's reactivity to novelty and reward and the tendency toward maybe shyness or toward boldness. Kagan's formulation was also explicitly biological, and Kagan would do things like measure physiological traits like the heart rate or cortisol levels, and then correlate those with behavioral observations and a child's responses to unfamiliar stimuli. Gray, explicitly neuropsychological. Kagan, very similar, but focusing more on behavioral inhibition. And then we have Rothbart, who created a multidimensional model of temperament, but focused a lot on reactivity and on self-regulation, frustration tolerance, fear versus positive affect, and the child's ability to effortfully control that, to orient their attention in a certain place and to maintain that attention. When thinking about Rothberg, think about reactivity and self-regulation. Reactivity can be positive or negative, and self-regulation requires effortful top-down control and attention focusing and maintenance. The last three researchers I talked about were Eisenberg, Schermerhorn, and Bates, and they all focused on interactions between either the environment, the social situation, or parenting, and a child's temperament. Eisenberg focused on the intensity of emotional reactions, a child's emotionality, and how well they could regulate those as far as being able to become successful in social situations in the future, especially negative emotions like anger or sadness. These required observational type measurements where parents or teachers would get questionnaires about children and fill them out, or children would be observed in different social contexts. Now, Schermerhorn and Bates were very similar, but they really emphasized this goodness of fit between the temperament and the environment and the interaction of temperament with parenting style. So the key concept for them was this transactional model. a child's temperament and the parenting mutually influence each other over time. It's very similar to Rothbard's model in that it focused on extroversion, negative affectivity, effortful control, but did a lot to try to elucidate the transactional aspects of these. All of the temperament researchers agree that there is a biological basis to temperament, but that it can be shaped by experience. Where they disagree is what they emphasize in that model and how they conceptualize a child's motivation or reactivity or response to the world. As I move on through this series, my next stop is probably going to be conditioning, so classical and operant conditioning. And it's a very different approach to thinking about things like temperament or psychosexual models or attachment, because conditioning basically says we pay attention only to behavior and we mostly just ignore what's going on internally. So until next time, I'm Dr. O'Leary, and this has been an episode of Sidactic Caps Edition. Nothing in this podcast should be considered personal, medical, or mental health advice.